She cleaned his hotel suite every week, until she saw the ring her mother cried over for 30 years. She was nobody. That's how people treated her. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the invisible people around us. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Corner Market buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting their harsh white glow across Emma Rodriguez as she mechanically bagged groceries for customers who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Her hands, cracked from years of manual labor and cheap soap, moved with practiced efficiency. Paper or plastic, heavy items on the bottom, eggs on top. Always the same routine, always the same polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. At 28, Emma carried herself with the weary resignation of someone twice her age. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, secured with a rubber band that had seen better days. The market's red polyester vest hung loose on her thin frame, faded from countless industrial washes that had stripped away both color and dignity. Her only pair of sneakers, purchased 3 years ago from a discount store, bore holes in the soles that she'd covered with duct tape, a detail she hoped customers wouldn't notice as she stood behind the register for 8-hour shifts. But Murphy's Market was only half of Emma's daily existence. Each morning, before the sun painted the Chicago skyline in shades of rose and gold, she walked the 43 blocks to the Franklin Grand Hotel, where she cleaned the suites of people whose weekly spending exceeded her annual income. Millionaires, tech executives, foreign investors, people who inhabited a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have been from different planets. The hotel work required her to be invisible in ways that went beyond simple discretion. She learned to move like a ghost through marble-lined hallways, to clean around sleeping guests without disturbing their dreams, to pretend she couldn't hear the conversations about mergers and acquisitions that happened as if she weren't in the room. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, had made it clear during Emma's first week, the less they notice you, the better you're doing your job. Emma had perfected the art of invisibility. She knew which elevator buttons to press to avoid encountering guests during shift changes. She memorized the schedules of regular visitors so she could clean their suites when they were out conducting business. She became an expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated whether a room's occupant was the type to leave generous tips or the type to complain about dust on surfaces that hadn't been touched in weeks. Her morning routine was sacred in its simplicity. Wake at 4:30 a.m. in her studio apartment, a generous term for the converted basement storage room she rented for $600 a month. Instant coffee with powdered creamer, 2 slices of day-old bread, toasted in a temperamental toaster oven, a quick shower in the tiny bathroom she shared with 3 other tenants. Then the walk to the Franklin Grand, her cleaning supplies cart squeaking rhythmically against the sidewalk as she navigated streets that transformed from industrial warehouses to luxury storefronts with each passing block. The contrast never stopped jarring her. She'd walk past boutiques where individual handbags cost more than she earned in 6 months, past restaurants where the wine list included bottles that represented years of her salary. Sometimes she'd pause outside these establishments, not with envy exactly, but with a kind of anthropological curiosity about how the other half lived. What did it feel like to choose clothing based on preference rather than price? What did it mean to eat dinner without calculating the cost of each ingredient? These questions followed her through the hotel's service entrance, where she changed into her cleaning uniform, grey pants and a white polo shirt with Franklin Grand Housekeeping embroidered in discreet lettering. The uniform was provided by the hotel, but laundered at her own expense, another small cost that ate into her already meager budget. She'd learned to spot clean stains immediately and to hang the uniform carefully each night to minimize wrinkles, because replacement uniforms required a $50 deposit she couldn't afford. The penthouse suites were her regular assignment, floors 38 through 42 where the air seemed rarefied and the silence carried weight. These rooms cost more per night than she earned in a month, and their occupants treated luxury like oxygen, invisible, essential, and utterly taken for granted. She'd seen marble bathrooms larger than her entire apartment, walk-in closets that could house several families, living rooms decorated with art that museum curators would covet. Her clients, though they never thought of her that way, were creatures of habit and excess. Mr. Davidson from the tech company always left his contacts scattered across the bathroom counter and expected them to be organized by prescription strength. Mrs. Hamilton demanded that her shoes be arranged by color and heel height, a task that required 20 minutes of careful positioning to achieve the precise aesthetic that satisfied her unspoken standards. The oil executive in Suite 4201 insisted that his newspapers be pressed flat and arranged chronologically, even though he typically discarded them unread. Emma learned to anticipate these preferences, to provide service that felt magical because it appeared effortless. She became fluent in the language of luxury, knowing which thread count sheets required special handling, which imported soaps couldn't be refilled from generic containers, which temperature settings would satisfy guests who'd never learned to adjust their own thermostats. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of her job wasn't the physical labor or the exacting standards. It was the emotional labor of maintaining her humanity while being treated as functionally non-existent. Guests would discuss intimate family problems while she scrubbed their bathtubs. They'd conduct business calls involving millions of dollars while she organized their belongings. They'd complain about their staff, their spouses, their children, speaking as freely as if she were a piece of furniture. The loneliness was crushing. Emma had no family except the memory of her mother, Susan, who had died 2 years earlier after a brief but devastating battle with cancer. Susan had raised her daughter with love, but also with secrets, moving them frequently during Emma's childhood, working temporary jobs that never lasted more than a few months, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting danger from unknown sources. "We have to stay small," Susan would whisper during their frequent relocations. "We have to be quiet. There are people who might want to hurt us if they knew where we were." These warnings had shaped Emma's entire worldview, teaching her that safety meant invisibility, that survival required constant vigilance against threats she didn't understand. Susan had been beautiful once. Emma could see it in the few photographs her mother had allowed them to keep. High cheekbones, dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, a smile that suggested confidence and joy. But by the time Emma was old enough to form permanent memories, her mother had become someone else. Careful, anxious, always ready to disappear at a moment's notice. The cancer had taken Susan quickly, too quickly for proper goodbyes or final explanations. In her last lucid moments, lying in a hospital bed covered by charity care, Susan had gripped Emma's hand with surprising strength. "Forgive me, baby," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines that measured her failing vital signs. "I did what I had to do. Someday you'll understand." But understanding had never come. Emma was left with fragments, partial stories about a father who might have been dangerous, hints about a life Susan had abandoned to keep them both safe, and most mysteriously, the memory of a ring. The ring lived in Emma's memory like a ghost that refused to be exorcised, haunting her dreams and surfacing in quiet moments when her guard was down. She'd been 7 years old when her mother showed it to her, a moment so vivid that even 21 years later, she could recall every detail with crystalline clarity. It had been a Tuesday evening in their cramped apartment in Riverside, the 4th place they'd lived since Emma's 5th birthday. Susan had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at the canned soup and crackers that constituted their typical meal, her dark eyes distant and troubled. Emma had learned to read her mother's moods like weather patterns, recognizing the signs that indicated they might need to pack their few belongings and disappear in the middle of the night. "Mama, are we moving again?" Emma had asked, her small voice carrying the resignation of a child who'd learned that stability was a luxury they couldn't afford. Susan had looked at her daughter for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, a crack in the careful facade she maintained, to protect them both from truths too dangerous for a 7-year-old to understand. Without speaking, she'd risen from their folding table and walked to the bedroom, returning with a small wooden jewelry box that Emma had never seen before. The box itself was unremarkable, dark wood scratched from years of handling, its tiny hinges slightly loose. But when Susan opened it, the contents took Emma's breath away. Nestled in faded blue velvet lay the most beautiful piece of jewelry she'd ever seen, an emerald the size of a teardrop, surrounded by diamonds that caught the lamplight and threw rainbows across the apartment's dingy walls. "This," Susan had whispered, her fingers trembling as she lifted the ring, "was given to me by your father." Emma's heart had stopped. Her father was a forbidden subject, a mystery wrapped in warnings and half-truths that her mother deflected whenever curiosity got the better of childhood discretion. All Emma knew was that he was dangerous, or perhaps the people around him were dangerous. The details shifted depending on Susan's mood and level of anxiety. "He loved me," Susan continued, her voice breaking as she held the ring up to the light. "Or I thought he did. Maybe he still does. I don't know anymore." She turned the band slowly, revealing an intricate crest etched into the metal, a design that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than their shabby living room. "Why don't you wear it, Mama?" Emma had asked, mesmerized by the way the emerald seemed to glow with inner fire. Susan's laugh was bitter, painful to hear, because beautiful things like this belong to beautiful people, people with money, with power, with choices, people who don't have to run. She closed the ring in her fist, knuckles white with tension. "I can't go back to that world, Emma. It would destroy us both." That night, Emma had pressed her ear to the thin wall between their bedrooms and listened to her mother cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere so broken that no amount of comfort could heal it. She'd never seen the ring again after that evening, though she'd searched their belongings during their frequent moves, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious emerald that connected her to a father she'd never known. Over the years, Emma had convinced herself that perhaps she'd imagined the whole thing. Childhood memories could be unreliable after all, and the ring seemed too magnificent, too otherworldly to have actually existed in their modest circumstances. Maybe it had been costume jewelry, made to look expensive but actually worthless. Maybe her 7-year-old eyes had transformed something ordinary into something magical because she desperately wanted her mysterious father to be someone important, someone who would someday rescue them from their perpetual state of near poverty. But the memory persisted, growing stronger rather than fading with time. She could recall the exact weight of the ring in her small hands when Susan had allowed her to hold it briefly. She remembered the way the emerald felt cool against her palm, the smooth perfection of the diamonds, the intricate detail of the engraved crest that spoke of heritage and history, far removed from their hand-to-mouth existence. The ring became a symbol of everything missing from Emma's life: stability, security, a father who might have provided the kind of protection that would have allowed them to stay in one place long enough to form real friendships. She'd spent her teenage years crafting elaborate fantasies about her father. Perhaps he was a successful businessman who didn't know she existed, or maybe he was searching for them, but couldn't find them because of Susan's careful efforts to remain hidden. These dreams sustained her through the worst periods of their poverty, through the nights when dinner was whatever they could afford from the dollar menu, through the embarrassment of wearing the same clothes to school day after day, while other children enjoyed wardrobes that reflected their family's financial stability. If her father was someone important, someone wealthy, then perhaps their current circumstances were temporary, a sacrifice that would eventually be rewarded when truth finally emerged. Susan's death had shattered these comforting illusions. Whatever secrets her mother had carried to the grave would remain buried, leaving Emma with questions that could never be answered and mysteries that would never be solved. The ring, if it had ever truly existed, was lost along with any hope of understanding her own origins, or finding the father who remained nothing more than a collection of whispered warnings and bitter tears. Working at the Franklin Grand had only intensified Emma's sense of disconnection from the world her father might have inhabited. Every day, she cleaned the suites of people who possessed the kind of wealth and power that her mother had spoken of with such fear and longing. She organized the belongings of men who wore watches worth more than her annual salary, who discussed business deals involving sums that might as well have been fictional numbers for all the relevance they had to her daily existence. These guests existed in a realm where problems were solved with phone calls and money, where discomfort was eliminated by staff who anticipated needs before they were expressed, where luxury wasn't a goal, but a baseline assumption about how life should function. Emma had learned to move among them like an anthropologist, studying an alien culture, observing their habits and preferences while remaining fundamentally separate from their reality. Mrs. Hamilton, the pharmaceutical heiress who occupied Suite 4102 for 3 weeks each month, treated Emma with the casual dismissiveness reserved for household appliances. She would discuss intimate family dramas while Emma cleaned her bathroom, sharing details about her children's marriages and divorces, her husband's infidelities, her own struggles with addiction and recovery, all while looking through Emma as if she were transparent. Mr. Davidson, the technology mogul who'd revolutionized social media platforms, spoke to Emma only to issue instructions or corrections. "The water glasses need to be spotless," he'd say, examining them with the intensity of a quality control inspector. "I can't have clients seeing water spots when they visit." He never said please or thank you, never acknowledged that Emma was a human being deserving of basic courtesy. The oil executive in Suite 4201 was perhaps the worst of all. He had a habit of leaving his expensive jewelry scattered across his dresser, gold watches, platinum cufflinks, rings that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent, as if daring the housekeeping staff to prove their honesty. He would time her cleaning sessions, complaining to management if she took longer than his predetermined schedule allowed, never considering that thoroughness might require additional time or that treating employees with respect might improve their performance. These daily humiliations accumulated like small cuts, each incident individually bearable, but collectively devastating to Emma's sense of self-worth. She began to internalize their treatment, wondering if perhaps she really was invisible, if perhaps her mother had been right to hide them both from a world that would never accept people like them as fully human. The other housekeeping staff at the Franklin Grand were equally invisible, equally disposable in the eyes of management and guests alike. Maria, who'd been working there for 15 years, warned Emma during her first week, "Don't expect them to remember your name. Don't expect them to see you as anything more than a service they're paying for. And whatever you do, don't get attached to any of them, because they'll replace you without a second thought if you make even the smallest mistake." Emma had followed this advice religiously, maintaining professional distance while providing impeccable service. She learned to anticipate needs without being asked, to solve problems before they became complaints, to exist in the background of other people's lives, without ever stepping into the foreground where she might be noticed as an individual rather than a function. But sometimes, late at night in her tiny apartment, Emma would lie awake wondering what her life might have been like if Susan had made different choices. What if they hadn't run? What if her mother had trusted Emma's father enough to build a life with him instead of fleeing into a decades-long exile that had shaped every aspect of Emma's existence? What if the ring had been the beginning of something beautiful instead of the symbol of everything they'd lost? These questions tormented her because they had no answers, because her mother was gone, and her father remained a mystery wrapped in warnings that might have been justified or might have been the product of fear and misunderstanding. Emma was trapped between two worlds, too poor to belong among the wealthy guests she served, but too haunted by the possibility of hidden heritage to accept her current circumstances as permanent. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of bitter Chicago wind that cut through even the thickest winter coats, but Emma barely noticed the cold as she pushed her cleaning cart through the Franklin Grand service corridors. She'd been assigned to the penthouse level again, Suite 4205, which had been occupied for the past week by a businessman whose name she'd glimpsed on reservation sheets but never bothered to memorize. In her experience, learning their names only made the inevitable dismissiveness more personal, more painful. The elevator climbed silently to the 42nd floor, its polished mirrors reflecting Emma's tired face back at her from multiple angles. She looked older than her 28 years, she realized, the kind of premature aging that came from too much worry and too little rest. Her cleaning uniform was pristine, pressed carefully the night before, but it couldn't disguise the exhaustion that had settled into her bones, like an ache that never quite disappeared. Suite 4205 was among the hotel's most expensive accommodations, a sprawling apartment that could have housed 6 families comfortably. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Lake Michigan, where morning light danced across water that stretched to the horizon like a promise of escape. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and original artwork lined walls that spoke of wealth so established it didn't need to announce itself. Emma had cleaned this suite twice before during the guest's stay, noting his meticulous habits and expensive tastes. His clothing was custom-tailored, bearing labels from designers, whose names she recognized from magazines, but whose prices existed in a realm far beyond her comprehension. His luggage was leather so fine it probably cost more than her annual grocery budget. Everything about the space screamed old money, the kind of generational wealth that created its own gravity, bending the world around it to accommodate its desires. She began her routine methodically, dust the surfaces, vacuum the Persian rugs, organize the scattered business documents that spoke of acquisitions and mergers involving sums that made her head spin. The guest was out, as usual, during her morning cleaning schedule, attending whatever meetings or appointments filled the days of people whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. In the master bedroom, she stripped the Egyptian cotton sheets, thread count so high they felt like silk, and began the careful process of making the bed according to the hotel's exacting standards. Hospital corners, perfectly aligned pillows, coverlet smoothed until no wrinkle remained. It was mindless work that allowed her thoughts to drift, usually to practical concerns like whether she'd have enough money for groceries this week or whether her landlord would accept another late rent payment. But as she moved toward the dresser to dust its mahogany surface, something caught her eye that made her heart stop completely. There, sitting in an open jewelry box lined with midnight blue velvet, was the ring. Not similar to the ring from her memories, not reminiscent of the ring her mother had shown her 21 years ago, the exact same ring, the emerald that glowed like captured starlight, the diamonds arranged in a pattern that had haunted her dreams. The intricate crest etched into the band with details so precise they could have been carved yesterday. Emma's cleaning rag fell from nerveless fingers. The vacuum cleaner in her other hand rattled against the dresser as her body betrayed her with trembling she couldn't control. This wasn't possible. The ring from her childhood existed only in memory, a beautiful illusion created by a 7-year-old's desperate need to believe her absent father was someone special, someone worthy of the pain her mother carried like a physical wound. But here it was, real and solid and absolutely undeniable. She stepped closer, her professional training warring with personal shock. Guests' jewelry was strictly off-limits. Even touching personal items without explicit permission could result in immediate termination. But this wasn't just any piece of jewelry. This was the center of every mystery that had shaped her existence, the key to questions that had tortured her for decades. Her hands shook as she reached toward the box, stopping just short of touching the ring that seemed to pulse with significance. The emerald was exactly as she remembered, that perfect teardrop of green fire that seemed to contain entire worlds within its depths. The diamonds caught the morning light streaming through the windows, throwing rainbow fragments across the dresser's polished surface. The band was platinum or white gold, heavy and substantial in a way that spoke of value beyond mere monetary worth. But it was the crest that confirmed her certainty beyond any doubt. Etched into the metal with microscopic precision was a design she'd never forgotten, intertwining vines that formed a family seal, surrounded by symbols that suggested European heritage and old bloodlines. She'd spent years trying to sketch that crest from memory, never quite capturing the elegance of its execution, but never forgetting its essential elements. The sound of a keycard in the suite's front door made Emma jump back from the dresser as if she'd been burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled to retrieve her fallen cleaning supplies, trying to compose herself before the guest discovered her in what might appear to be a compromising position. Heavy footsteps crossed the living room's hardwood floors, measured confident strides that spoke of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. Emma focused on her cleaning with desperate intensity, hoping the guest would follow his usual pattern of ignoring her completely while she finished her work in the bedroom. Instead, the footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. Emma turned to see him standing in the doorway, tall, distinguished, perhaps in his early 50s, with salt-and-pepper hair styled with understated elegance. His suit was obviously bespoke, cut to emphasize broad shoulders and a still athletic frame. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath completely. Dark brown, almost black, with the same shape and intensity that stared back at her from mirrors every morning. Her eyes. Her father's eyes. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately and completely. Emma opened her mouth to deliver the standard apology. "Sorry for the intrusion, just finishing up, we'll be out of your way in a moment." But no words came. She was staring at the ring, then at his face, then back at the ring, her mind struggling to process information that seemed to violate the basic laws of reality. The man followed her gaze to the open jewelry box, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to sharp attention. Something in her face must have conveyed more than professional embarrassment, because his own features went through a transformation, confusion, then concern, then something that looked almost like recognition. "My mother," Emma whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. She had a ring just like that, exactly like that. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush them both. The guest's face went pale, color draining from his complexion, as if someone had opened a valve and let his life force pour onto the Persian rug. He gripped the doorframe with white knuckles, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. "What was your mother's name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile moment they'd stumbled into. "Susan," Emma said, then added her mother's maiden name like a prayer offered to an uncertain God. "Susan Ellis." The effect was immediate and devastating. The man stumbled backward, reaching for the nearest chair, with hands that shook almost as badly as Emma's. He sat down heavily, his expensive suit creasing as his body folded in on itself. For a moment, he looked decades older, as if the weight of years had settled on his shoulders all at once. "She's supposed to be dead," he said, staring at Emma with an expression of wonder and horror. "There was a car accident 29 years ago. I went to the funeral. I mourned her for—" His voice trailed off as the implications of Emma's presence began to register. "How old are you?" 28, Emma whispered. The mathematics was simple and devastating. If Susan had supposedly died 29 years ago, but Emma was 28 years old, then the car accident had been staged. Susan had faked her own death and disappeared, taking with her a secret that was standing in this hotel room, wearing a housekeeping uniform and staring at the father she'd never known existed. "She died 2 years ago," Emma said, feeling obligated to deliver news that would destroy whatever hope had just sparked in his eyes. "Cancer. She never told me. She never said." The words caught in her throat as the full magnitude of her mother's deception began to sink in. For 28 years, Susan had allowed this man to believe she was dead. For 28 years, Emma had grown up without a father, while he lived his life believing the woman he'd loved and the child he'd never known had been taken from him by random tragedy. "I gave her that ring," he said, reaching toward the jewelry box with trembling fingers. "The night I proposed, she said yes. We were planning a spring wedding. And then—" He lifted the ring, holding it up to the light as Emma had seen her mother do decades earlier. "I thought she was gone forever." Emma sank onto the edge of the unmade bed, her legs no longer capable of supporting her weight. Everything she'd believed about her life, about her mother's choices, about the reasons for their constant running, was crumbling around her like a house built on sand. Susan hadn't been protecting them from a dangerous man. She'd been protecting this man from them, or protecting Emma from him, or protecting herself from a love that had apparently been too overwhelming to survive. "She said you were dangerous," Emma whispered, "or that the people around you were dangerous. She said we had to hide. We moved constantly. She never let me get close to anyone. She worked jobs where no one would ask questions, where we could disappear at a moment's notice if we needed to." The man, her father, though the word felt foreign and impossible, closed his eyes as if her words were physical blows. "I was young, stupid. My family had enemies, business rivals who might have used her to get to me, but I would have protected her. I would have given up everything to keep her safe." "She kept the ring," Emma said, the revelation feeling important somehow. "All those years, through all our moves, through every crisis, she kept it hidden, but she kept it. I only saw it once when I was 7. She cried when she looked at it." His face crumpled with grief for love lost and years stolen. In that moment, Emma saw not the intimidating businessman who owned a hotel suite that cost more per week than she earned in a year, but a man who'd spent 3 decades mourning a woman who'd chosen exile over explanation, sacrifice over trust. The silence stretched between them like a chasm filled with 28 years of missed birthdays, unanswered questions, and love that had been buried alive. Emma stared at this stranger who shared her eyes, this man whose blood ran through her veins, but whose world existed so far from hers that they might as well have been different species. The hotel suite suddenly felt too small to contain the magnitude of what they'd discovered, too luxurious to accommodate the raw grief that hung in the air like smoke. "What's your name?" she whispered, realizing with a shock that she didn't even know her own father's name. "William," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "William Charles Hartford." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. "And you're Emma? Emma Ellis." She kept her maiden name. Emma nodded, then shook her head, confusion swirling through her like storm clouds. "I don't understand any of this. Why would she fake her death? Why would she run from you if you loved each other? Why would she let you think we were both dead?" William set the ring carefully back in its velvet-lined box, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. "Your mother was always afraid," he said slowly, as if each word required tremendous effort. "Not of me, but of what being with me meant. The Hartford family. We're not just wealthy, Emma. We're powerful in ways that attract dangerous attention. He stood and walked to the windows overlooking Lake Michigan, his silhouette framed against the morning light. When I met Susan, she was working as a waitress in a little cafe near the university. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but more than that, she was real, genuine. She didn't care about my family's money or influence. She loved me for who I was, not what I represented. Emma watched him carefully, noting the way his shoulders tensed as he spoke, the controlled manner in which he breathed. This was a man accustomed to hiding his emotions, to maintaining composure, even when his world was falling apart. But being a Hartford comes with a price, William continued. Business rivals who would use any weakness against us, political enemies who saw our influence as a threat. There were incidents, threats against people I cared about. My younger sister received death threats when she was in college. A cousin was kidnapped for ransom when I was 25. The words hit Emma like physical blows. Her mother hadn't been paranoid or irrational. The danger had been real, concrete, the kind of threat that could destroy innocent lives for the crime of loving the wrong person. I thought I could protect her, William said, his voice breaking slightly. I hired security, made arrangements for her safety. But Susan was terrified. She said she couldn't live in a gilded cage, couldn't spend her life looking over her shoulder, wondering if every stranger was a potential threat. Emma's mind raced, piecing together fragments of her childhood that suddenly made horrifying sense. The way Susan would freeze when strangers approached them too quickly, the careful way she scanned parking lots before getting out of their car, the fear in her eyes whenever Emma asked too many questions about their frequent moves. The night before our wedding, William continued, she came to me crying. She said she'd been contacted by someone who knew details about my family's business dealings, someone who'd threatened to hurt her if she went through with the marriage. She begged me to let her go, to let her disappear so that no one could use her against me. But you didn't let her go, Emma said, confusion evident in her voice. She faked her death instead. William turned from the window, his face a mask of pain that had been decades in the making. I refused. I was 23, arrogant, convinced that love could conquer any obstacle. I told her we'd face whatever came together, that I'd rather die than live without her. He laughed bitterly. I was young enough to think that sounded romantic rather than selfish. So she made the choice for both of you, Emma whispered, understanding beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. 3 days after our argument, I got the call about the accident. A car crash on a rainy night. The vehicle went off a bridge into the river. They found her purse, her identification, but he swallowed hard. They said the current was too strong. Her body was never recovered. Emma felt sick, imagining the elaborate deception her mother must have orchestrated. The false identification, the staged accident, the careful planning required to disappear completely from a life she'd loved enough to sacrifice everything for. I mourned her for 30 years, William said, his voice barely audible. I never married anyone else, never had children with anyone else. I threw myself into business, built the Hartford empire into something that could have protected her from any threat, made us untouchable, but it was all meaningless without her. The irony was devastating. William had spent 3 decades accumulating the kind of power and wealth that could have solved the problems that had driven Susan away, while she had spent those same years living in poverty and fear, raising their daughter in the shadows of a life they should have shared. She worked so hard, Emma said, tears finally spilling over, cleaning houses, waitressing, picking fruit during harvest seasons. We never stayed anywhere long enough for me to make real friends. She was always tired, always worried, always looking over her shoulder. And you were here the whole time. William moved toward her then, stopping just close enough that she could see the tears in his eyes. What was she like? As a mother? Was she happy? Ever? The question broke Emma's heart because the honest answer was so complicated. She loved me, she said carefully. She sacrificed everything for me. But happy? I don't think so. She carried sadness like other people carry purses. It was always with her, always weighing her down. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at nothing, and I knew she was thinking about something she'd lost. You, William said simply. She was thinking about you. The hotel room's phone rang, a sharp intrusion into their private catastrophe. William ignored it completely, his attention focused entirely on the daughter he'd never known existed. But the sound reminded Emma of something crucial. She was supposed to be working. She was an employee in this man's hotel, wearing a uniform that marked her as service staff, standing in a suite that cost more per night than she'd ever had in her bank account at one time. "I should go," she said, sudden panic flooding through her. "I'm not supposed to be... guests aren't supposed to be bothered during cleaning, and I've been here too long, and Mrs. Chen will be looking for me." "Emma, stop!" William's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of people. "You're not going anywhere. Not today, not until we figure out what happens next." "What happens next?" Emma laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. "I'm a housekeeper. You're whatever you are. Rich, powerful. You live in a world I can't even imagine, and I live in a basement apartment where the heat doesn't work half the time." "We don't have a what happens next." William studied her for a long moment, and she could see him processing not just her words, but her appearance. The cheap uniform, the worn shoes, the weight loss that came from choosing between rent and groceries too many times. His face cycled through emotions, shock, anger, guilt, and something that might have been determination. "How much do you make?" he asked quietly. Emma flushed with embarrassment. "That's not... It doesn't matter." "How much, Emma?" $12 an hour here, $10.50 at the grocery store. About 30 hours a week total if I'm lucky." The words felt like admissions of failure, proof that she'd been unable to create the kind of life that would make her worthy of being his daughter. William's face went white. 30 hours a week, at less than $13 an hour. He was calculating, she realized, doing the math that would tell him exactly how little she'd been surviving on, while he lived in luxury that could have supported hundreds of families. "Where do you live?" he asked. Emma wanted to lie, to protect what little dignity she had left, but the truth felt unavoidable now. "Basement apartment in Pilsen, $600 a month, plus utilities. It's not much, but it's mine. $600. William repeated the number as if it were a foreign concept. Emma knew that he probably spent more than that on individual meals, that $600 was less than he might tip for exceptional service. The gap between their worlds suddenly felt insurmountable. How could they possibly build any kind of relationship when everything about their lives emphasized the chasm that Susan's choices had created? He was a Hartford, whatever that meant in terms of power and influence. She was Emma Ellis, a woman who counted quarters to buy groceries and wore the same 3 outfits to work because she couldn't afford more. "I don't belong in your life," Emma said, the words tearing her throat as she spoke them. "My mother was right to run. People like me don't belong in your world. People like you." William's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You're my daughter. You're a Hartford. You belong wherever you choose to belong." "I'm not a Hartford," Emma protested. "I'm nobody. I'm invisible. I clean hotel rooms and bag groceries and live in a basement. I'm exactly the kind of person you and your guests look right through every day." William was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft but filled with steel. "Your mother ran because she was afraid. But fear doesn't have to be inherited, Emma. You get to choose what happens next." Outside the suite's windows, Chicago hummed with life. Millions of people going about their daily routines, unaware that in one hotel room, 2 lives were being completely rewritten by truth that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. The knock on the suite door came like a gunshot in the charged silence between them. Emma's heart lurched as she recognized the sharp, authoritative rap that could only belong to Mrs. Chen, the head of housekeeping who ruled her domain with military precision and zero tolerance for delays or irregularities. "Emma Rodriguez, are you in there?" Mrs. Chen's voice carried through the heavy door, clipped and dangerous. "You were supposed to complete this suite 40 minutes ago. The guest has complained about the delay." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. In her shock at discovering William, she'd completely forgotten that she was still on duty, still expected to maintain the hotel's exacting standards while her entire world crumbled around her. The guest complaint was a lie. William hadn't had time to contact anyone, but Mrs. Chen was clearly angry enough to fabricate reasons for confrontation. "I have to go," Emma whispered to William, panic rising in her throat. "If I lose this job, I can't lose this job. I need the money, I need the insurance, Emma, wait." William moved toward the door, but she was already gathering her cleaning supplies with desperate efficiency, trying to look like she'd been working instead of discovering the father she'd never known existed. Mrs. Chen knocked again, harder this time. "Rodriguez, open this door immediately, or consider yourself terminated." Emma's hands shook as she smoothed her uniform and checked her appearance in the dresser mirror. She looked exactly like what she was, a minimum wage worker caught where she didn't belong, about to be humiliated in front of the wealthy guest she'd been hired to serve invisibly. She opened the door to find Mrs. Chen flanked by two other housekeeping supervisors, their faces set in expressions of professional disappointment that somehow managed to convey both authority and condescension. Mrs. Chen was a compact woman in her 50s who'd worked her way up from cleaning rooms to managing staff, and she wielded her hard-earned authority like a weapon against employees who threatened the smooth operation of her department. 43 minutes, Mrs. Chen announced, consulting her clipboard with theatrical precision, to clean a suite that should take 25 minutes maximum. Would you care to explain what could possibly justify such inexcusable negligence? Emma opened her mouth to respond, but what could she possibly say? That she'd discovered her father was a guest in the hotel, that her entire life had been rewritten in the space of a conversation, that everything she'd believed about her existence had turned out to be an elaborate lie constructed by a mother who'd been trying to protect them both. "I'm sorry," she managed, the words feeling inadequate for both. The accusation and the magnitude of what had just transpired. "I was being thorough, making sure everything met the guest standards." Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly the kind of insubordination she'd been hoping to discover. "Thorough? Or were you perhaps taking your time because you knew the guest was away and thought you could slack off without consequences?" Behind Emma, she could hear William moving closer to the door, and she prayed he would stay back, would let her handle this without getting involved. The last thing she needed was for Mrs. Chen to discover that she'd been having personal conversations with a guest instead of focusing on her assigned duties. "The guest is actually here," Mrs. Chen continued, consulting her clipboard again. "Mr. Hartford returned early from his meeting and specifically requested that housekeeping explain the delay. He's waiting in the living room to discuss your performance." Emma's stomach dropped to her feet. Mrs. Chen was going to make her explain herself in front of William, was going to dress her down for incompetence while he watched, would probably fire her for poor performance while her own father stood by helplessly. The humiliation would be complete. Not only would she lose the job she desperately needed, but William would witness her professional destruction, would see exactly how powerless and disposable she was in the world he inhabited so effortlessly. "Perhaps," Mrs. Chen said with the kind of smile that promised pain, "you'd like to personally apologize to Mr. Hartford for disrupting his schedule with your unprofessional behavior." Emma followed Mrs. Chen into the suite's living room, her cleaning cart rattling behind her like chains dragging a condemned prisoner to execution. William stood near the windows, his back to them, hands clasped behind him, in a posture that suggested controlled tension. When he turned to face them, his expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of their earlier conversation. "Mr. Hartford," Mrs. Chen began with the obsequious tone she reserved for wealthy guests, "I sincerely apologize for the unacceptable delay in completing your suite. Rodriguez here seems to have forgotten that our guest's time is valuable and that efficiency is our primary concern." William's eyes met Emma's briefly, and she saw something flash there. Anger, she realized, but not directed at her. "I see," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made Mrs. Chen straighten unconsciously. "And what exactly are you proposing to do about this one situation?" "Immediate termination," Mrs. Chen announced with obvious satisfaction. "We cannot tolerate this level of unprofessionalism from our staff. Rodriguez will be removed from the premises immediately, and we'll ensure this kind of incident never happens again." Emma felt the world tilt sideways. Termination meant no final paycheck, no unemployment benefits, no reference for future employment. It meant explaining to her landlord why she couldn't pay rent, meant choosing between electricity and food, meant the kind of downward spiral that could transform someone from working poor to homeless in a matter of weeks. "That seems rather harsh," William said quietly. But Mrs. Chen was already warming to her theme. "Mr. Hartford, you must understand that maintaining standards is crucial to the Franklin Grand's reputation. When employees take advantage of our guest's absence to slack off, when they prioritize their own convenience over your comfort, immediate action is the only appropriate response." She turned to Emma with undisguised contempt. "Rodriguez, you will gather your personal belongings from your locker and leave the building within 15 minutes. Security will escort you out to ensure you don't disturb any other guests." The casual cruelty of it took Emma's breath away. 8 months of perfect performance, of arriving early and staying late, of covering shifts for sick colleagues and working through her own illnesses, all erased by a single incident that hadn't even been her fault. She was being sacrificed to demonstrate Mrs. Chen's authority, turned into an object lesson for other employees who might consider stepping out of line. "Actually," William said, his voice cutting through Mrs. Chen's self-righteous lecture like a blade, "I don't believe termination will be necessary." Mrs. Chen blinked, clearly taken aback by the guest's interference in what she considered a purely internal matter. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but staff discipline is really not something our guests need to worry about. We handle these matters professionally and—" "Ms. Rodriguez was not slacking off," William interrupted, his tone growing colder. "She was responding to specific instructions I gave her regarding the cleaning of my jewelry collection. I required additional time for her to properly care for some rather valuable pieces, and I was quite satisfied with her attention to detail." Emma stared at him in shock. He was lying to protect her job, using his status as a wealthy guest to shield her from Mrs. Chen's vindictive punishment. But the lie also highlighted the fundamental inequality between them. He could rewrite reality with a few words because he had money and power, while she remained helpless, dependent on his intervention for basic survival. Mrs. Chen's expression cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and barely concealed anger. Of course, Mr. Hartford. If you required additional services, that certainly explains the delay. However, protocol dictates that any special requests should be communicated through management, so we can adjust our scheduling accordingly." "I'll keep that in mind for future visits," William said, his dismissal of her complaint as smooth as silk. "In the meantime, I'm quite satisfied with Ms. Rodriguez's work. In fact, I'd like to request her specifically for the remainder of my stay." The power dynamics were stark and undeniable. Mrs. Chen had to accept William's protection of Emma because he represented the kind of revenue that kept the hotel profitable, because alienating wealthy guests was a firing offense that would end her own career in hospitality management. Emma was saved, but only because someone with more power had chosen to intervene on her behalf. "Of course, sir," Mrs. Chen said through gritted teeth. "Rodriguez will be assigned exclusively to your suite for the remainder of your stay. Is there anything else you require?" "Privacy to discuss my specific needs with Ms. Rodriguez," William said firmly. "I trust that won't be a problem." Mrs. Chen had no choice but to retreat, leading her supervisors out of the suite with as much dignity as she could muster. But Emma could see the fury in her eyes, the promise of future retaliation for this public humiliation. The moment William checked out of the hotel, Mrs. Chen would find reasons to make Emma's life miserable, would scrutinize her work with the kind of hostile attention that made employment unbearable. When the door closed behind them, Emma sank onto the nearest chair, her legs finally giving out completely. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like illness. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words tasted bitter. "You saved my job. For now," William said grimly. "But we both know she'll find another way to fire you the moment I'm no longer here to protect you." Emma nodded, understanding the temporary nature of her reprieve. "It doesn't matter. At least I'll have a few more days to figure out what comes next." "What comes next," William said, settling into the chair across from her, "is that you stop living like this. You stop accepting scraps and abuse from people who have no right to treat you as disposable." "Easy for you to say," Emma replied, exhaustion making her bold. "You can rewrite reality with a phone call. You can protect me because you have power, but I don't. When you leave, I'll still be nobody. I'll still be the kind of person they can fire for sport." William was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. "You're right," he said finally. "I do have power, more than you can imagine. And you're my daughter, which means that power extends to you whether you want it or not." "I don't want it," Emma said quickly. "I don't want to be rescued. I don't want to be saved by money I didn't earn. I want to be able to take care of myself." "And you will," William said. "But first you need to understand exactly what you're choosing to walk away from." 3 days passed in a strange suspension of reality. Emma continued her cleaning duties at the Franklin Grand, but now she was assigned exclusively to William's suite, which meant long conversations disguised as work instructions and revelations that unraveled everything she'd believed about her place in the world. William had extended his stay indefinitely, claiming urgent business matters that required his presence in Chicago, but Emma understood he was really trying to figure out how to bridge 28 years of separation in the space of a few hotel conversations. During those 3 days, she learned that her father wasn't just wealthy. He was William Hartford, heir to one of America's oldest industrial fortunes. Hartford Steel had built half the skyscrapers in Chicago, and Hartford Industries now encompassed everything from renewable energy to technology development. The family name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and charitable foundations that donated more money annually than most people would see in multiple lifetimes. She also learned that he'd never stopped looking for her mother, had hired private investigators for decades to search for any trace of Susan Ellis or evidence that she might have survived the staged accident. He'd kept the ring in his jewelry collection like a shrine, carrying it with him whenever he traveled, unable to let go of the only tangible connection to the love he'd lost. But the most devastating revelation came on the third afternoon, when William showed Emma photographs from his phone, images of a life she should have been part of, birthday parties with no child to celebrate, Christmas mornings with presents that would never be opened, a bedroom in his Chicago mansion that he'd kept decorated for a daughter he'd dreamed of having, complete with books and toys and clothes in sizes that grew larger each year as he imagined how she might have developed. "I know this sounds insane," William said, scrolling through pictures of the bedroom that looked like a shrine to childhood fantasies, "but I used to buy you birthday presents every year on the day Susan would have given birth if she'd lived. I'd wrap them and put them in that room and tell myself that somehow, somewhere you were having a happy birthday." Emma stared at the photographs with tears streaming down her face. The room was beautiful, pale yellow walls, built-in bookshelves filled with classic literature, a window seat overlooking gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. It was the childhood bedroom she'd dreamed of during all those years of cramped apartments and second-hand furniture, the stable sanctuary she'd imagined when they were packing hastily in the middle of the night because Susan's paranoia had convinced her they needed to move again. "Stop," she whispered, pushing the phone away. "Please stop showing me this. Emma, you have to understand." "Understand what?" The words burst out of her with volcanic force, carrying years of suppressed anger and grief. "That while I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and wearing shoes with holes in them to school, you were building me a fantasy bedroom in a mansion I'll never belong in? That while my mother was working herself to death to keep us hidden, you were buying presents for a daughter who didn't exist?" William set the phone aside, his face stricken. "You did exist. You always existed. I just didn't know where you were." "But I didn't exist in your world," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I existed in a basement apartment, where the heat doesn't work and the neighbors scream at each other through paper-thin walls. I existed counting quarters to buy groceries and walking 43 blocks to work because I can't afford a car. That's the reality of who I am, not some fairy tale bedroom you created for a daughter you invented." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to collapse the hotel around them. Outside the windows, Chicago hummed with afternoon traffic, oblivious to the collision of two worlds that had never been meant to intersect. "What do you want me to do?" William asked finally, his voice barely audible. "Tell me what you want, and I'll make it happen." Emma laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "That's exactly the problem. You think everything can be fixed with money and power. You think you can erase 28 years of poverty and struggle by writing a check or making a phone call. But some things can't be bought, William. Some damage can't be undone. So what are you saying? That we just pretend this never happened? That I go back to my life and you go back to yours and we act like we never found each other?" The question hung between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut through every fantasy and force them to confront the brutal reality of their situation. Emma looked around the suite that cost more per night than she earned in a month, at the man who could solve her financial problems with a casual gesture, but couldn't give her back the childhood she'd lost or the mother who'd died, believing she'd made the right choice. "I'm saying," Emma said slowly, "that I don't know how to be your daughter. I don't know how to live in your world. I don't know how to accept help without feeling like I'm betraying everything my mother sacrificed to protect me from." William stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Your mother was wrong," he said quietly. "Not about the dangers, those were real, but about running being the only solution. We could have found another way. We could have faced it together." "Maybe," Emma said, "but she made her choice, and that choice created me. Not the version of me you imagined, but the real me. The one who knows what it feels like to be invisible, who understands what it means to work for people who see you as disposable. And I don't know if I want to give that up to become someone I'm not." Before William could respond, His phone rang with the aggressive urgency that indicated an important business call. He glanced at the screen, then at Emma, clearly torn between his professional obligations and the conversation that was determining the shape of their future relationship. "Take it," Emma said. "I'll finish cleaning." As William stepped into the bedroom to take his call, Emma heard fragments of conversation that painted a picture of the complex business empire he managed. Merger negotiations, board meetings, decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. This was his reality, a world where every choice reverberated through corporate hierarchies and international markets, where personal desires had to be balanced against institutional responsibilities. She understood then why her mother had been afraid, not just of physical danger, but of being consumed by a machine too large and complex for normal human relationships to survive. How did you love someone whose every decision affected so many lives? How did you build intimacy with a person whose phone never stopped ringing with crises that demanded immediate attention? When William returned 20 minutes later, his expression was grim. "I have to go back to New York tomorrow," he said. "There's a hostile takeover attempt, and the board needs me there to coordinate our response." Emma nodded, feeling relief and disappointment in equal measure. His departure would end this surreal interlude and return her to the predictable misery of her regular existence, but it would also close the door on possibilities she was still too frightened to examine. "Before I go," William said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want you to have this." He pulled out a business card, simple, elegant, with just his name and a phone number embossed in silver lettering. But when Emma turned it over, she found something else. A check written in William's careful handwriting for $50,000. "I can't take this," she said immediately, trying to hand it back. "It's not charity," William said firmly. "It's not a gift. It's recognition of what you should have had all along. It's 28 years of child support, college tuition I should have paid, Christmas presents I should have given you. It's the bare minimum of what I owe you as your father." Emma stared at the check, at numbers that represented more money than she'd ever imagined having at one time. $50,000 could pay off her debts, could give her breathing room to find better employment, could transform her life from constant crisis management to something approaching stability. But it could also transform her into someone she didn't recognize, could make her dependent on a man she barely knew, could validate every cruel assumption about poor people being eager to be rescued by their wealthy betters. "If you take it," William continued, reading her hesitation correctly, "it doesn't mean you belong to me. It doesn't mean you have to become someone you're not. It just means you have choices you've never had before. And maybe, if you want, it means we can get to know each other as equals instead of as a rich man and the daughter who cleans his hotel room." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like snow. Outside, Chicago continued its relentless motion, people hurrying to jobs that barely paid enough to survive, struggling with the daily mathematics of poverty that she knew so intimately. Part of her wanted to stay in that familiar world, to continue fighting battles she understood, even if she rarely won them. But another part of her, the part that had wondered her entire life about the father who'd remained a mystery, whispered that maybe accepting help wasn't the same as admitting defeat. Maybe her mother's sacrifices didn't require Emma to suffer indefinitely. Maybe choosing a different path didn't mean betraying the woman who'd loved her enough to give up everything. Emma opened her eyes and looked at William, really looked at him, not as the intimidating wealthy guest she'd been trained to serve invisibly, but as the man who shared her eyes and had spent 30 years missing people he'd never stopped loving. "If I take this," she said slowly, "what happens next?" William's smile was soft, tentative, filled with hope he was afraid to fully acknowledge. "Whatever you want to happen, whatever you're ready for. We can start slow, phone calls, maybe dinner when I'm in Chicago. Or we can start big. I can introduce you to the family, show you the business, help you figure out what kind of life you want to build." Emma held the check up to the light, watching the way it seemed to shimmer with possibility. $50,000. Enough to change everything. Enough to choose her own future, instead of having it chosen for her by circumstances beyond her control. "Okay," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of transformation. "Okay." And for the first time in 28 years, Emma Rodriguez felt like she might actually have a future worth fighting for. 6 months later, Emma stood in front of the full-length mirror in her new apartment, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The cramped basement studio was a memory now, replaced by a light-filled one-bedroom in Lincoln Park, with windows that actually opened and heat that worked consistently. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a careful, sometimes painful process of learning to accept help while maintaining her independence. The $50,000 had been invested wisely with William's guidance, not spent frivolously on luxuries she didn't need. Most of it went toward practical changes, paying off debt, securing better housing, purchasing reliable transportation, and enrolling in a business program at Northwestern University's evening division. Emma had insisted on earning her way forward rather than simply being handed a new life, and William had respected that choice even when his instincts told him to solve all her problems immediately. The woman in the mirror wore clothes that actually fit properly, not expensive designer pieces, but quality garments purchased with the knowledge that she could afford to replace them if necessary. Her hair was styled professionally for the first time in her adult life, cut and colored to enhance features that had been hidden under years of exhaustion and neglect. But the most dramatic change was in her posture, the way she carried herself with growing confidence, instead of the apologetic slouch of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from William. "Are you ready for tonight? I'll pick you up at 7. Tonight was the Hartford Industries annual charity gala, the first major family event William had invited her to attend. For months, he'd been patient about integrating her into his world, understanding that the transition from invisible service worker to acknowledged daughter required more than just changing her wardrobe. They'd had dinner together every few weeks when his business brought him to Chicago, slowly building a relationship that felt authentic rather than obligatory. But the gala would be different. Tonight, William planned to publicly acknowledge Emma as his daughter, in front of Chicago's business and social elite, the same people who'd looked through her for years while she cleaned their hotel suites and bagged their groceries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd be attending an event where she might encounter some of her former customers, but now she'd be William Hartford's daughter instead of anonymous help. The dress hanging on her closet door was elegant, but not ostentatious. Midnight blue silk that William's assistant had helped her select from a boutique that catered to professional women rather than society mavens. Emma had insisted on something appropriate, but not costume-like, wanting to honor the occasion without pretending to be someone she wasn't. As she prepared for the evening, Emma reflected on the changes that had reshaped her life over the past 6 months. Leaving her jobs at the Franklin Grand and Murphy's Market had been surprisingly difficult, not because she'd missed the work itself, but because those positions had defined her identity for so long. Mrs. Chen had been predictably vindictive about her departure, spreading rumors that Emma had manipulated a wealthy guest into giving her money. The gossip had hurt, but Emma was learning to care less about the opinions of people who'd never bothered to see her as human. Returning to school had been both exhilarating and terrifying. At 28, she was older than most of her classmates in the business program, and her background was dramatically different from students who'd come directly from undergraduate degrees at prestigious universities. But her work experience gave her perspectives that her younger classmates lacked, and her professors quickly recognized her practical intelligence and strong work ethic. The relationship with William continued to evolve in unexpected ways. He wasn't trying to replace the father she'd never had. They were both too aware of the lost years for that kind of fantasy. Instead, they were building something new, a friendship between equals who happened to share DNA and a complicated history. William had been careful not to overwhelm her with his wealth, understanding that money couldn't purchase trust or affection. But he'd also been strategic about helping her understand the world she was entering. He'd introduced her to key family members gradually, starting with his sister Margaret, who'd welcomed Emma with genuine warmth and helped her navigate the complex social dynamics of the Hartford extended family. Through Margaret, Emma learned about family traditions, business relationships, and the philanthropic causes that had shaped the Hartford reputation for generations. The doorbell interrupted her preparations. William arrived precisely at 7, looking distinguished in his formal tuxedo, but wearing the slightly nervous expression of a father introducing his daughter to society for the first time. In his hands was a small velvet box that made Emma's heart skip. "Before we go," he said, "I wanted you to have this. It belonged to your grandmother, my mother, and she would have wanted you to wear it tonight." Inside the box was a delicate diamond necklace, the stones arranged in a pattern that caught the light with understated elegance. It was clearly valuable, but not showy, the kind of heirloom that spoke of family history rather than financial display. "Are you sure?" Emma asked, understanding the significance of the gesture. This wasn't just jewelry. It was acceptance into a family legacy that stretched back generations. "I've never been more certain of anything," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my daughter, Emma. You're a Hartford, and tonight, everyone is going to know it." The drive to the Palmer House Hotel gave Emma time to process her nervousness. 6 months ago, she'd been cleaning suites in this same neighborhood, invisible to the people who would be her peers tonight. The transformation felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life rather than reclaiming her own. The gala was everything Emma had expected and more. Hundreds of Chicago's most influential residents gathered in a ballroom that dripped with crystal and gold leaf, each guest representing wealth and power that shaped the city's political and economic landscape. The women wore gowns that cost more than Emma's former annual salary, while the men conducted business deals between courses of a dinner that had been planned by celebrity chefs. William guided her through the crowd with gentle confidence, introducing her to business associates, family friends, and social connections with obvious pride. "This is my daughter Emma," he would say, and each time the words seemed to gain strength and certainty. The reactions were varied and telling. Some people welcomed her warmly, genuinely pleased to meet William's long-lost daughter and impressed by her poise and intelligence. Others were politely curious, asking carefully worded questions about her background and education, but a few responded with barely concealed skepticism, their expressions suggesting they wondered what kind of woman could have hidden a Hartford heir for nearly 3 decades. The most challenging moment came when Emma encountered Mrs. Davidson, wife of the technology mogul whose hotel suite she'd cleaned for months. Mrs. Davidson studied Emma's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, clearly recognizing her, but unable to place the context. "You look so familiar," Mrs. Davidson said, her tone suggesting this was bothering her more than it should. "Have we met before?" Emma felt William tense beside her, understanding that this was exactly the kind of encounter they'd both feared. "I don't believe so," Emma replied smoothly, falling back on the social training Margaret had provided. "Though Chicago can feel like a small town sometimes," Mrs. Davidson remained unconvinced, but was distracted by other conversations before she could pursue the matter further. Emma realized that her transformation had been complete enough to make her previous invisibility work in her favor. The wealthy woman who'd ignored her for months couldn't reconcile the confident young woman at the gala with the anonymous service worker she'd never bothered to truly see. The evening's climax came during William's speech to the assembled guests. As chairman of Hartford Industries, he was expected to address the crowd about the company's charitable initiatives and community commitments. But halfway through his prepared remarks, he deviated from the script. "Before I continue," William said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sophisticated sound system, "I want to share something personal with all of you. 6 months ago, I discovered something I'd thought lost forever. Family." The room quieted, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Emma felt her heart racing as William gestured for her to join him at the podium. "This is my daughter, Emma Rodriguez," William announced, his voice filled with pride and emotion. "For 28 years, I believed she and her mother had died in a tragic accident. But sometimes, life grants us miracles we never expected. Emma has not only survived but thrived, despite circumstances that would have defeated lesser spirits." The applause was thunderous, but Emma barely heard it over the rushing of blood in her ears. She was standing in front of 500 of Chicago's most powerful residents, being acknowledged as William Hartford's heir, accepted into a world that had never seen her as anything more than invisible help. "Emma represents everything the Hartford family values," William continued. "Resilience in the face of adversity, hard work as a path to achievement, and the understanding that true wealth comes not from what we possess, but from what we contribute to our communities." As the applause continued, Emma looked out at the crowd and saw something she'd never expected. Respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement that money could buy, but genuine admiration for a story of survival and transformation that resonated even with people who'd never faced real hardship. Later that evening, as they stood on the hotel's terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline, William handed Emma something that made her breath catch. It was a key, old-fashioned brass, worn smooth by generations of handling. "This opens the safe in my study," he said quietly. Inside, you'll find documents that make you a full partner in Hartford Industries, not because of charity or obligation, but because you've earned your place in this family. Emma held the key, feeling its weight both literally and symbolically. 6 months ago, she'd been nobody, invisible, disposable, forgotten by a world that had never bothered to see her potential. Tonight, she was a Hartford, acknowledged and accepted, with the power to shape not just her own future, but the futures of thousands of employees and countless community members who would benefit from the family's continued success. The transformation was complete, but Emma understood that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She had work to do, a legacy to build, and a responsibility to use her new position to ensure that other invisible people might someday have their own opportunities for recognition and respect. As she looked out over the city, where she'd struggled for so long, Emma smiled. Tomorrow she would begin the real work of becoming the woman she was meant to be, not just William Hartford's daughter, but Emma Hartford, a force for change in her own right. 2 years later, Emma Hartford stood in the executive conference room on the 40th floor of the Hartford Industries building, looking out at the same Chicago skyline she'd once viewed from the basement apartment where she'd counted quarters for groceries. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just William's daughter or a beneficiary of family wealth. She was the newly appointed Director of Community Outreach, a position she'd earned through 2 years of dedicated work, completed education, and a vision that was transforming how the company engaged with the city's most vulnerable populations. The mahogany conference table was surrounded by Hartford Industries senior executives, all waiting for Emma to present her latest initiative. The irony wasn't lost on her that some of these same people had probably stayed in the Franklin Grand Hotel during her housekeeping days, walking past her without a glance while she cleaned around them like a ghost. The Hartford Opportunity Program, Emma began, activating the presentation screen with confidence that would have been unimaginable during her invisible years, isn't just about charity. It's about recognizing untapped potential in communities that traditional businesses overlook. The program was Emma's brainchild, born from her intimate understanding of what it meant to be dismissed, undervalued, and written off by society. She'd convinced the Hartford Industries board to invest $50 million in job training, education partnerships, and small business development in Chicago's most underserved neighborhoods, the same areas where she'd once lived and struggled. "We're not looking for charity cases," Emma continued, making eye contact with each board member as she spoke. "We're looking for people like Maria Santos, who's been cleaning office buildings for 15 years while putting herself through nursing school at night. We're looking for Marcus Williams, who's been working 3 part-time jobs while developing a revolutionary app for delivery logistics. We're looking for the invisible workforce that keeps this city running while being told they don't have the right background for advancement." Margaret Hartford, William's sister, who'd become Emma's closest family ally, smiled with obvious pride. "The pilot program results speak for themselves," Margaret added. 93% job placement rate, with average salary increases of 48% for participants. But more importantly, we're seeing generational impact. Parents who can now afford to invest in their children's education, families moving out of crisis housing into stable communities. Emma clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of program graduates at their new jobs, people who'd been invisible service workers just months earlier, now employed as medical technicians, project managers, and small business owners. Each face represented a story she understood intimately, a journey from dismissed to dignified that resonated with her own transformation. "The economic impact extends beyond individual success stories," Emma explained, her voice carrying the authority that came from lived experience combined with formal business training. "Every family that moves from survival mode to stability mode contributes more to local tax bases, requires fewer social services, and invests more in community development. It's not just moral imperative, it's sound business strategy." William sat at the head of the table, watching his daughter with an expression of awe that never quite faded, even after 2 years of witnessing her growth into a formidable business leader. The scared young woman who'd been afraid to accept his help had evolved into someone who commanded respect through competence rather than inherited privilege. The presentation concluded with unanimous board approval for expanding the program citywide. As the executives filed out, discussing implementation details and budget allocations, Emma remained at the window, processing the magnitude of what had just been approved. $50 million would create opportunities for thousands of people who were currently trapped in the same cycle of invisibility and poverty she'd escaped. "Proud of you doesn't begin to cover it," William said, joining her at the window. "You've taken everything this family stands for and made it better, more meaningful." Emma smiled, but her expression carried traces of melancholy that William had learned to recognize. "I keep thinking about her," Emma said quietly. "About Mom, about whether she'd be proud or if she'd think I've betrayed everything she sacrificed to protect me from." It was a conversation they'd had many times over the past 2 years, as Emma struggled to reconcile her new life with her mother's choices. Susan's decision to run had been born from fear, but it had also shaped Emma in ways that made her current success possible. The years of struggle had given her empathy and understanding that couldn't be taught in business schools or inherited through family connections. "Your mother loved you enough to give up everything," William said, his voice gentle but firm. "She'd be proud of what you've become, but more than that, she'd be amazed by how you're using your position to help others avoid the struggles you both endured." Emma's phone buzzed with a text that made her smile. A photo from Maria Santos, the former cleaning woman who was now completing her final semester of nursing school with Hartford Opportunity Program support. Maria's daughter was in the photo too, wearing a uniform from the private school she could now attend, thanks to her mother's increased earning potential. "The ripple effects," Emma murmured, showing William the photo. "That little girl will grow up knowing her mother is a professional, not just someone who cleans up after other people. She'll have opportunities we're creating right now." As they left the office building together, Emma caught sight of their reflection in the polished marble lobby. A successful father and daughter, both dressed in expensive suits, clearly belonging to the world of power and influence that shaped the city around them. But Emma still remembered what it felt like to be invisible in spaces like this, still carried the knowledge of what it meant to be dismissed and undervalued. That evening, Emma made a stop that had become a monthly ritual. She drove to the cemetery where her mother was buried, carrying fresh flowers and updates about her life that Susan would never hear, but somehow needed to share anyway. The headstone was simple: Susan Ellis, beloved mother, with no mention of the Hartford connection that had defined so much of her life. Emma had offered to have it replaced with something more elaborate, but she decided that her mother had chosen simplicity and anonymity in life, and that choice deserved respect in death. "I got the expansion approved today, Mom," Emma said, arranging the white roses she'd brought. $50 million to help people like us, people you would have understood." She sat on the small bench she'd installed near the grave, watching the late afternoon sun paint the cemetery in shades of gold and amber. "I think you'd like who I've become," Emma continued, her voice soft but certain. "I'm not the scared little girl who used to pack our belongings in the middle of the night. But I'm also not some entitled rich woman who's forgotten where she came from. I'm something in between, someone who remembers what it's like to be invisible, but now has the power to make other people visible." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, and Emma chose to interpret it as approval. She'd learned to find peace with her mother's choices, understanding that Susan's decision to run had been motivated by love rather than fear, by the desire to protect her daughter from a world that could be both wonderful and dangerous. The drive home took Emma through neighborhoods where the Hartford Opportunity Program was already making a difference. She passed the community center, where job training classes were held, the partnership schools where adult education programs helped people complete their degrees, the small businesses that had received startup funding and were now thriving employers in their communities. At a red light, Emma found herself stopped next to Murphy's Corner Market, where she'd bagged groceries for 4 years while dreaming of something better. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the same red vests moved between the aisles, the same customers hurried through their shopping without really seeing the people who served them. But now Emma saw those workers differently, not as permanent fixtures in minimum wage jobs, but as potential program participants, as future success stories waiting for the right opportunity. Next month, Hartford Industries would partner with corner markets throughout the city to offer management training and small business development support to employees who showed leadership potential. Emma's phone rang as the light turned green. The caller ID showed Margaret's name, and she answered through her car's hands-free system. "Turn on Channel 7, Margaret said excitedly. "They're running a feature about the program, and they interviewed some of the graduates. You need to see this." That evening, Emma watched the news segment from her apartment, seeing her work validated by the media coverage that would help other companies understand the value of investing in overlooked communities. The reporter had interviewed Marcus Williams, the delivery logistics app developer, who now employed 12 people and was expanding to 3 more cities. The Hartford Opportunity Program didn't just give me money, Marcus said in the interview. They gave me respect. They saw potential where other people saw problems. Emma Hartford understands what it's like to be invisible because she's been there herself. The segment concluded with footage from the charity gala, where William had first introduced Emma as his daughter, contrasting her nervous debut with recent video of her confidently addressing business leaders about community investment strategies. The transformation was striking, but what impressed Emma most was how natural she looked in her current role, not like someone playing dress-up, but like someone who'd grown into her full potential. Later that night, as Emma prepared for bed in her Lincoln Park apartment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been afraid to accept help because she thought it would change who she was. Now she understood that accepting help hadn't changed her. It had revealed who she'd always been underneath the circumstances that had kept her hidden. She was still Emma Rodriguez, the girl who'd learned to be invisible to survive. But she was also Emma Hartford, the woman who used her visibility to ensure other people could be seen. The combination of both identities made her stronger, more effective, more capable of creating the kind of change that honored both her mother's sacrifices and her father's love. On her nightstand sat the emerald ring that had started everything, the same ring her mother had cried over, the same ring that had connected her to a father she'd never known existed. William had given it to her on the anniversary of their first meeting, along with the deed to the house where he'd kept her childhood bedroom decorated for 30 years. Emma didn't wear the ring often. It was too valuable, too historically significant to risk in daily activities. But she kept it close as a reminder that love could survive even the most impossible circumstances, that families could be rebuilt even after decades of separation, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life were hidden, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. As she turned off the lights, Emma smiled at the irony that her story had come full circle. She'd started as invisible help in the world of the wealthy, and now she was a wealthy woman helping the invisible. The difference was that now she had the power to ensure that invisibility was temporary, that everyone deserved the chance to be seen, recognized, and valued for their full potential. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand the program and help more people transition from survival to success. But tonight, Emma Hartford, daughter, businesswoman, advocate for the invisible, slept peacefully, knowing that her mother's sacrifices had led to something beautiful and that her father's love had made it possible for her to transform pain into purpose. Have you ever felt invisible, overlooked, or undervalued because of your job, your circumstances, or where you came from? Have you known someone whose potential was dismissed because they didn't fit society's expectations of success? If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe. It helps spread this message of hope to others who might need to hear that their current circumstances don't define their future potential. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.